And so I just want to encourage other educators to be okay with that kind of messy feeling, that we don't have to check every box in order, right? There are boxes we have to check, but we can do it in a way that makes sense for our learners and makes sense for us.
Awesome. And those of you that have joined, if you have a specific question you want to ask Andi, feel free to type it in the chat or raise your hand. So chapter 2, I absolutely loved this chapter. So I drew this person and put all these different things around it whenever you talked about Gen Z kids and the kids that we've had. And I've heard a ton of presentations, as I'm sure lots of people have, about Gen Z kids, but your approach I thought was neat and good reflection for me. Can you just kind of share some of the highlights of what you talk about without giving it all away, but happen to want to read more about what you say about Gen Z kids?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a big fan of Gen Z. I'm not going to lie. I will go to bat for them every single day. I talk about how amazing this generation of kids, how amazing they are and what they're capable of doing. And so often they get a bad rap, not because they're necessarily doing anything wrong, but because they're very different than us. We know that Gen Z has an 8-second attention span. We know that they are collaborative. They're just collaborative in a different way. We also know that this generation wants to change the world. They want to have an impact on the world around them. And guys, if I'm honest, when I was in school, I don't know that that was what was on my mind. I went to school, I played the school game well, checked the boxes, but I didn't really think about impacting the world around me until I was an adult. And these guys are starting to think about that at a very young age because of their access to the world. And so, without giving anything away, I'll just tell you that chapter 2 really digs into who Gen Z is, what we can do as educators to meet them where they are. Because unless we do that, we'll never be able to fully engage them, right? That's a big conversation right now. How do we engage these guys and how do we get to that willingness to invest? And I think the first step in doing that is knowing them well, respecting who they are as a generation, and understanding that there are things that they can learn from us for sure, but there are definitely things that we can learn from them as well. And I think that's exciting. And I'm just a big fan of who they are as a generation and what they bring to the table. So that's what chapter 2 is all about, just those different things and how we as educators can use those strengths in the classroom versus always seeing them as a weakness.
The teachers learning from the student. I really like that part, and kind of, I know in chapter 3, the title talking about, or no, not 3, before, letting go. Like how, so as a teacher, like how does that letting go part involve when it comes to learning from your students themselves? Because that's tough, that letting go.
It is. Willie, it's so true. That was so hard for me because I told you guys, I was a super traditional teacher. And by all intents and purposes, I was a good teacher. Like I had good test scores, I had good relationships, but none of that matters if I'm not doing something that's meaningful for them, right? And so I had to get to that place. And I'll tell you, the first time we started doing Genius Hour, or we started doing something that felt a little bit uncomfortable, I remember telling Don Wettrick, who wrote Pure Genius, and we were good friends at the time and still are, but I remember telling him, like, I don't think this is okay. Like, I don't know what you guys are doing in Indiana, but in Texas, I'm really worried about this. But the more we did it, the more I realized this isn't separate from what I do every day, right? I was still doing the things I was being asked to do. I still think the standards are important. I think they're a roadmap, and without them, it would be hard to teach. I still think it's important that we prepare our students for STAR. All of those things were still important, but that didn't mean that I couldn't do it in a way that made sense for my learners. So, Willie, I think that's where I had to get to was, yes, I am giving up a little bit of control, but the reality is if I don't do that, things feel out of control anyway, right? I already don't have as much control as I think that I have. And so I really had to come to that realization of, checking off these boxes isn't necessarily being in control, and having to let go of some of that was hard at first, but it began to make more sense kind of towards as I began to take more risks, I guess. Does that help?
So I'm going to go kind of with what you said about Gen Z, and then you talk about it again in chapter 5. So try to tie those kind of two together. And you talk a lot about empowerment versus compliance, but really you talk a lot about feedback and how Gen Z kids like instant feedback. They're used to instant feedback. And then you tie that to growth and grades. Can you tell a little bit about how you address some of that in the book?
Yeah, so empowerment and engagement, all of those things are so important. And as I kind of in the book started talking about feedback, I was really talking about how that, so often we focus on grades and we're not there yet. I always like to say that, right? We're not there yet where grades are not a thing in education, but we are at a place where we have an opportunity to not only focus on grades, but also focus on feedback. And if you think about them as a generation and think about some of the things that they do, feedback is something that is important for them. It's something that they give all the time. Think about Amazon, right? They write reviews and they share reviews on Yelp and all of those things. So feedback is something that they value. And if you think about it, when you were in school and you got, a paper with a grade at the top, not many of us were super connected to that. And so I always like to say these guys, if you give them a paper with a 65 on it, a week later after they've worked on it, and then I remember as a teacher, like I would give a kid a paper and it would have a 65 at the top. And I would wonder, like, why are you not stressed about this? Or why are you not more upset about this grade? Well, y'all, if we think about all of the things that they have taken in during that week, YouTube, TikTok, they're completely disconnected from that learning experience. And so that grade means nothing. However, if we can give them feedback, that can change everything. So I think right now it's grades plus feedback that have to happen. But man, if you want to get to that relational place with a learner where you can create a relationship, and I'll just be honest and say, without a relationship with a learner, it's really hard to engage them. But if we can get to that place where we're offering feedback, I think that's where relationships start. That's where they start to realize, wait a second, I'm more than a number here. I'm more than just a worksheet. They actually saw the work that I did and took the time to provide information or conversation around that.
So Dr. Perez put a comment question, and it really ties into another one of your chapters about reflection. So I'll go ahead and go there now, and I don't know if you'll take it to reflection versus remembering, which is chapter 10. But she talks about, would you agree that the educator has to value feedback and know what effective feedback is for each student and be willing to do it?
Absolutely. And I mean, that's the goal. It can't just be, I'm doing feedback for the sake of doing feedback, because if we're honest, if that's the reality, you're going to get burned out and you're not going to want to continue to do it. One of the things that I didn't talk about in this book, but we'll be talking about something that's coming, is that whole idea of things being manageable and meaningful. And so I think feedback has to be that, right? It has to be manageable for the educator. You can't give feedback for every kid all the time, every assignment. But in order for it to be meaningful, every kid does deserve feedback at some point. So yes, Amy, I definitely agree that the educator has to value the feedback. But if we're honest, we also have to teach our learners to value feedback and how to react to feedback. If you think about gifted learners in particular, a lot of times when they get negative feedback, what's their first thought? Like, wait, what? Like, you're not telling me I did it wrong, are you? Because I don't know if you know, I'm GT. They're not all like that, but some of them are. I can say that because I have gifted learners at home. But they have to learn to be able to take that feedback as well. And that's a real skill that they'll use beyond the walls of the classroom. And for me, as far as feedback goes, and some of the things that I talk about within the book, reflection, all of those things are so important beyond the walls of the classroom. And if I can do what they need in the classroom and beyond the walls of the classroom, that's when I began to feel like what I'm doing is worth it. And what I'm doing makes me want to be at work every day, right?
So you mentioned several times experience. That's one of your words. And so you talk about the 3 E's, and I wrote down in my quote, and then you can maybe use the design and experience instead of writing a lesson plan. So can you tell me a little bit about, tell them about the 3 E's that will make them want to read more about it?
Yeah, it's so funny that you say that. We actually have a joke at the service center that if I'm ever lacking a word, everybody just says experience, because that's got to be the word that I'm looking for. Because it's my favorite word. And one of the reasons it is because if you look that word up in the dictionary, it talks about how an experience leaves an impression. If you look up the word activity in the dictionary, it talks about how it's just something that someone or a group does. And I think you guys would agree. We want whatever we're doing in the classroom to leave an impression on our learners. Doing something just for the sake of doing it will burn us out because we feel like we're doing something that doesn't turn into something meaningful. So that whole idea of writing lesson plans versus designing an experience, I have worked with many, many school districts, and that small shift in and of itself of I'm not sitting down to write a lesson plan. I'm sitting down to design an experience. In other words, I'm sitting down to design something that's going to leave an impression on my learners is a game changer. And so in my mind, there are three pieces to that. And lots of school districts call these things different terms. But for me, the first thing you have to do is engage your learners. You have to get to a willingness to invest before you can provide an opportunity to learn. So engaging your learners first, and then giving them the experience, right? I'm going to provide that thing that's going to leave an impression, giving them the opportunity to learn the content, the standard, the idea. And then that last piece is empowering them to take that and use it beyond the walls of the classroom. I actually just wrote a blog post a couple of nights ago about purpose statements and how I don't think it's a bad idea to, at the end of a learning experience, instead of us telling them why they had to learn it with an objective, I think objectives are important at the beginning of a learning experience, but at the end of that, having them just write a simple sentence that says, today I learned blank so that I can, because it's that so that part I think that is really important. So yeah, those three pieces, engage, experience, empower, I think create an experience. We have kind of a running joke, and lots of people that I talk to often and kind of know me well. I don't use the word lesson plan often, and I don't use the word activity often. It just doesn't feel good coming out, because designing experiences seems so much more meaningful simply because of the definition of the word. Does that make sense, y'all? Okay.
I'm going to give a little bit of wait time before I ask the next question in case somebody else has something that's come to mind that they want to ask about. Not to make you uncomfortable, Missy.
I think I'm with Missy. Wait time makes me super anxious. Like I feel like I'm breaking into sweat.
I got you, Andy. I'm kind of like, okay, what can we say? What can we say? I try. Colette makes me do wait time, but it's real painful.
It's a nice running joke. That just shows we love each other, right? So chapter 9, you talk about going global, and my word for this year is connect or connections. And so at the bottom of this chapter, and really big, I wrote connections. What all, just give some high points of going global, because that sounds scary, I think, for some people.
Yeah, it does sound scary. Sometimes even still when I talk about it, I get a little nervous, like, oh, this is a big idea that I don't know if we're ready for yet. But the reality is, when you think about your learners, whether you teach elementary, middle school, or high school, they have access to information. I think about my own kids all the time, and how when I was younger and I would walk through the living room, that's how I would know what was going on in the world. If I happened to walk through during the 10 o'clock news, or my parents happened to talk about it at the table. My own children, however, know about what's going on in the world around us before I do, right? They tell me before I tell them. And so because of that, it's very important that they have that global perspective of, I can impact the world around me, and I can connect with someone on the other side of the world. And as educators, it's not that hard to make that happen. I think that for me, when I first started learning how to do that, I was really nervous, because I thought, how do we even do that? What does this look like? And as we began to make connections with people here in the United States, people in other countries, and we began to learn how to do that safely and how to do it well, it was a game changer, because my kids started to realize, you know what? Just because I go home at night and sleep in a really comfortable bed and have a really nice home they began to realize that that's not the case for everyone. And even some of their peers in our classroom don't get to experience that. But if we don't if we don't lead them into those conversations, if we don't help them find those things, they will use social media and they will use those tools that they have in an inappropriate way. But man, if we can teach them the power of connect, I love that word, Colette, that word of, we have a Connect at work, so I was thinking about her, Colette, that word of connection, because that's exactly what it's all about, is connecting them with learners all over the world so that they can see we are different, but we're not that different, right? And they begin to realize the impact they can have on the world around them. So yeah, I'm glad that that stood out to you. That word connect is big for me too.
I was looking for a clue from Willie. In chapter 10, you say, I'm like, I have some quotes highlighted and stuff, but you talk about reflection versus remembering. And you kind of touched on that a little bit, but you say things like replace remember with reflect. So because reflection is application. And you say you have a whole section called making reflection a priority. Can you tell me about why you think that should be important in the classroom? And
yeah, I think traditionally in school, we have made remembering a priority. I can remember when I was in the classroom and so many times I would say, remember, blah, 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 or don't forget, blah, blah, blah. But the problem with remembering, there's a taxonomy of reflection. I think that's probably written about in the book from Peter Pappas. And remembering is actually the very lowest, kind of the lowest part of what reflection should look like. So I always say remembering is what I did and how. Reflection is what I learned and why. And so if we want the learning to stick, we want to make reflection a priority. And I was actually talking with an educator one time. He came up after at a conference and he said to me, you know, I like that you talk about reflection, but I just want you to know that that's just not reality, because I teach from bell to bell. And I said to him, I totally get that, but I think you're misspeaking, because I would hope that you don't talk from bell to bell, right? I would hope that learning happens bell to bell, right? That's what we want, learning to happen bell to bell. But I said, look, I would be doing you a disservice if I wasn't completely honest. If you're talking from bell to bell, you might as well have them throw it in the trash on their way out. They will not remember it. They're just sitting in your classroom, checking the boxes, and they're walking out and forgetting everything that you said. However, if you share some things, if you're teaching or if they're learning, and then you just give up 2 or 3 minutes at the end of your learning experience to say, hey, you know what, let's kind of let this marinate. I always like to talk about that, how it is like marinating a steak, right? When we give it time to really sink in, it tastes better, it feels better, it's just a better experience. And so that reflection is really, really important, and it's not that hard to do. It is legit 2 or 3 minutes at the end of class. Turn and talk to your neighbor about this reflection question. It's that easy, but you get a huge return on your investment.
So I know you talk about not wanting to talk about lesson plan or using lesson plan, and so we'll say lesson design. So I like that too. So with the reflection, is that something that you just at the end of the period said, oh, you know what? Go ahead and time to reflect. When do you decide that that's something that I want them during or before, middle, and at, towards the end of the lesson?
Yeah, I think you cut out a little bit. Something that I plan. Is that what you were asking?
Okay, say that again.
Frozen for you guys.
Oh, yep, you are now. I can see Willie's eyes moving, so he's not frozen. Everybody else is moving, except for Andy. I know, I see Tammy waving. Diana's rocking in her chair. I got it. Travis is like, I don't know what you're doing. Your head's like sideways.
Oh, she's coming back. She'll be back.
Missy's famous with Jack Clemens.
That's Miss Zacharias.
Oh, that's your principal closet. Oh, that's good. She is in the principal closet.
He's been very concerned about her.
It's her timeout room.
Thank you, Jack, for being concerned about me, because this is not an ideal situation. but we're making it work.
Okay, Andy's back. There you go. Okay.
I'm a digital innovation specialist. I'm totally used to these things happening. If it happens, I'll just reconnect. It's fine. But Willie, we were talking about reflection. And yes, I think that, reflection has to be part of the learning experience as you're designing. It has to be intentional. I think that's kind of where you are going with that. Is it intentional? Is it just something? I do think that it has to be done in a way that is intentional, because that's what makes it meaningful. So in the book, I share a really cool way from my friend Tony Vincent. If you guys don't know Tony Vincent, he's kind of amazing. I share a really cool way to make reflection a priority that requires little to no work on your part. So definitely something to check out.
Yes, and I will say, without giving away, to encourage them to read, a lot of the resources that you mentioned are things that we have provided sessions on and embrace in our district as used for reflection and for connecting globally. A lot of those things, there were a few resources in there. You referenced the reflection toolkit I had not used before. So a lot of tools that I think they'll be familiar with. So it won't be all new learning, but also a lot of tools that you give that are, like you said, are easy to use and implement. Not a lot of prep time to be able to implement some of these things. You kind of end the book thinking that we're getting close to closing, and somebody might have some questions too, but you really end your book with kind of I don't know, I would say like a charge in a way, like of here's kind of my ending of what it takes to make your room a meaningful mess. Do you want to share any of those things with us?
Yeah, I don't have the book in front of me, and I wrote it a long time ago, but I will tell you that I do think that in order to make your classroom a meaningful mess, there has to be a willingness, right? There has to be a willingness to take risks. There has to be a willingness to try new things, all within the things you're expected to do. But there has to be that moment kind of that I had, that aha moment of, you know what, I want to love what I do every day. And I want my kids to love to be at school every day. And if I want that to be the reality, and it's not right now, something has to give, something has to change. And so I think I would just say that you guys as educators, I don't think you hear this enough. You are enough, and the work that you're doing is enough. But we can always, I had to remind myself of that constantly, because I had been in the classroom a long time before I got to this moment. And so when I had that aha moment, I felt like I had wasted so much time. Like, oh my gosh, was I like a terrible teacher all this time and I just didn't know it? But I wasn't. I did what I knew at the time, and that was fine. But there's a great quote, I think, from Maya Angelou, and she says, when you know better, you do better. And I just constantly reminded myself of that. When you know better, you do better. And I know better now, so I'm going to do better. So I would just say that my charge to you would be to be okay with things being messy, and to be okay with being a little bit uncomfortable, because sometimes, I tell my daughter this all the time, sometimes you have to go through the hard to get to the great, right? Sometimes what lies ahead of you is coming. You're not there yet, but it's coming. And, so I would just encourage you to be willing to go through the hard to get to the great, because when you get there, I'm telling you, I'm on the other side of it now. And when you get there, and when what you're doing is meaningful, it's addicting. And a lot of people ask me, hey, why did you leave the classroom if you loved it so much? And I'm going to be completely transparent with you guys. And I will tell you, I don't know that I won't go back to the classroom at some point. I miss the classroom very much, but I just wanted to have an opportunity to share with teachers what I had experienced. I thought about it, prayed about it, and I just wanted to say out loud, this can happen. You can do the things you have to do and do the things that feel right too. You can do both. And so that's really where I am in my career right now, is just wanting to help teachers get to that place, which is why I do the work that I do now. But I hope that makes sense. That was a long answer too, but man, I'm passionate about it just because I've been through it, I think.
Yes. And I mean, I think you talk about it a lot, like knowing what you have to do with your standards and what you have to teach, but designing an experience that you're passionate about and that makes it meaningful. And you say at the end, which I really loved, you talked about sharing your story. And I know each teacher has a story to tell, and ask for help, be transparent. That helps us all grow so much. And so you encourage them at the end to do that too. So I loved that. Willie, can you think of anything else, or anybody else have any last kind of questions or thoughts? Or Andy, any last thoughts you'd want to leave us with to encourage our friends to book and read it for their summer book study?
I think I would just want to say that, I really wrote that book from a place of honesty. It wasn't written from like, oh, let me do all this research and tell everybody what I think they should be doing. The book is not written that way. It was literally me sitting down at my computer and saying, you know what, this is what I went through. It was hard, but man, was it worth it. And so worth it that I want to sit here and write these pages to tell other educators what it can be like when you're willing to embrace things being a little bit messy. So I hope that you read it. I mean, and I hope that when you do, you realize that we really are all in this together. None of us who do this work ever want to come to the table and be like, well, we know everything, because guess what? We don't. And we failed and made mistakes like so many of you are going to do, and we're still doing it. But I like what Colette said about being transparent and sharing your stories, that it can change everything, because you guys have just as much to offer as I have to offer. And when we all come to the table and say, you know what I'm doing is working, here it is, or what I'm doing isn't working, can you help? It just, that culture of collaboration can change everything. So.
Our book for summer book study, and we're also excited to have you at the summit this summer, keynoting 2 of the days in July and offering some sessions throughout. And so we're super excited to have you. And I know I didn't touch on the deeper learning part in here, which you do touch on a little bit, and you also talked about that for us last summer too. So we appreciate you. We thank you for joining us this afternoon.
Yes.
We appreciate you doing that. And thank you to all of you teachers and staff that joined this afternoon and gave up your time to hear Andi and about her book and her message. So if you have any other questions, you can send them my way and I'll pass them on to Andi, or you can save them and come to the author Q&A. That is an option during the summit, and we'll provide you lunch if you want to stay and eat with Andi and ask her any questions that you want. She'll be there 2 days in a row for an author Q&A. So
yeah,
I think
I'm so excited to see you guys in person. Everybody at work is like, would you quit talking about all the in-person stuff? But I'm so excited. So I hope to see you guys. And I know a lot of you. And so I just, hey, to those of you that I know, and I will definitely see you this summer.
We are excited. Thank you so much again. Thank you guys. Y'all have a wonderful evening.